Well, good morning. So 2.5 years, are you ready? Just want to encourage you to do a little bit of reading in preparation for these, because we're going to be covering 12 chapters, the book of Daniel. So maybe over this next week you could spend, read the first 6 chapters, which is mainly the ones that Dave is going to preach on next week. And then the following week, read the last 6 chapters, which is going to be mainly the ones that, it's me again, preaching on. There's a lot to get through. But today we're not looking at the book of Daniel chapter by chapter. We're looking at themes. So today we're looking primarily at the theme of integrity. Next week we're looking at primarily the theme of the supernatural. And then the last week we're looking at the theme of prophecy. So that's what we're going to be looking at. So, Daniel. Just a little bit about the setting. So Judah had fallen. The royalty and the nobles had been enslaved and carried off to Babylon. The Babylonians' gods had won. Or at least that's how it would appear. And God had given up on Israel, according to verse 2. But actually, we're actually told that God had warned Israel many, many times about the long-term about the long-term consequences of ignoring him. We're told in Leviticus 25, in verse 1 to 7, Leviticus 26. We're told in Jeremiah, virtually the whole of that book. We're also told in 2 Chronicles. I want to read you a little bit from the end of 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles is where we get the history of the Israelite nation. And this is where it chronicles the events that happened in Daniel. And it says this in 2 Chronicles 36, verse 15, the very last chapter, because really we're at the end of the Israelite story. It said, "The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his word, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. He brought up against them the king of Babylon, the king of the Babylonians, who killed the young men with the sword in the sanctuary, and spared neither young man or young woman, old man or aged. God handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar." And that's where we get the history behind this. That God seems to have vanished. And the question that we have in this is, where is God? What's happened to God? He seems to have just not done anything. He seems to have allowed Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, to come and take away Israel, Judah. And that's a really, really important question to ask. Our actions, though, have consequences, or our lack of action have consequences. The consequences to the Jewish nation of not being in communion with God, of not living the life that God wanted them to live, was lived out in their nation. And a question to ask on this subject is God not stepping in the same as God doing an action? And I know you might think that phraseology is really clumsy or really close, but so let me expand on that. Is God not stepping in the same as God doing an action? So let's make this applicable to us in Southport last week. There was a woman murdered last week in Southport. God didn't step in. God could have stepped in and prevented that murder, and he didn't. Is it God's fault? Has God caused the murder? No, God didn't cause the murder. God didn't step in. The fault lies with the man, with the man's anger, with the man's sin, with the man's bitterness. The fault lies with the man. Or to put it another way, the fault lies with the man because of his lack of living a life according to God's instruction. We don't blame God in that situation. And we apply the same logic to the Israelite situation. It's not God's fault that Babylonia took over. We hear that God pleaded time and time again. We know all the prophets. We know what's happened, that to live according to these guidelines. and it didn't happen. And I would suggest that these consequences for Israel, we can extrapolate that for us as well. That societies and nations have consequences of not living, if they live opposed to the way that God sets out. Israel purposely chose to disobey God's laws. But I want to encourage you, based on that understanding, not to go down the route of blaming God for bad things. Be that the death of a loved one, which happens so often that we blame God for not stepping in, or a hurricane in the Caribbean, or a disaster in Africa. We as communities reap the consequences of our actions. It's selfishness in us that causes famine, that causes issues, that causes death, that causes murder. Selfishness that causes human misery. And we see in Daniel, that Daniel and his friends never ever blame God for what's happened to them. And in their circumstances, they're even remaining faithful to God, and still bad things happen. So where was God? I believe God was there all the time, crying out for these people that he loved, wanting them to be in relationship with him. So let's explore Daniel in a bit more detail. So if we go into the map here, it seems that Daniel was taken to Babylon in about 605 BC. That's what most of the experts think. So we can see Israel or Jerusalem over on that left-hand side, just at the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. And we can see Babylon, which is positioned in modern-day Iraq. And the experts have found the remains of that great city of Babylon, which is just below modern-day Baghdad. And that's the Babylonian Empire. And we find out later on in the story of Daniel, because Daniel lives throughout lots of kings. He starts with King Nebuchadnezzar, and then King Belshazzar takes over, and then we get King Darius who takes over. And King Darius is the Medes and the Persians on the right. They come and invade and take over the Babylonian Empire. And before them we had the Assyrians at the top, and the Nineveh. We'll cover that at some point in time with Jonah at some point in time. So that's the setting. But we're told, look at Chronicles, we're told that for the last few decades before this event, there was quite a few, for want of a better expression, puppet kings. There was kings that were in charge of Judah, in charge of Israel, not in charge of Judah, but really they were puppet kings to the Assyrians and then to the Babylonians. And the Babylonians then take Daniel and others. We read that story of lots of the royalty are taken to live, at the court in Babylon. And we get to the meat of chapter 1 that we read, and we get this poetic picture of Daniel, the superhero that we see before us. So we're told in verse 4 that he's a young man of no physical defect, handsome, can learn anything, and he's already really intelligent. I'm wondering what young men that reminds me of. I won't go there. We're told in verse 8 that he's a man of morals, a man of integrity. We're told in verse 17 that God had given him everything, and he could also interpret dreams. We're told in verse 20, wait for this, that he was 10 times better than the best Babylonian. That's a pretty impressive CV, that, isn't it? I also did a bit more research between the lines of chapter 1, and we're also told that he held every sports record in Babylon, and that he had 5 top 10 hit singles, and he won Artist of the Year 7 years running. We get the picture that's been painted here. Daniel is an impressive guy. And I kind of think, he was blessed by God and loved by God. But this kind of portrait of him, I'd like to say that for most of us, that if our parents were to write a little summary of us, it might be a little bit like this summary of Daniel. He's a guy who's loved by God and loved by the author of this book. And a little side point here is it's also written in a way to say Daniel is the next generation Joseph. You know, there's many similarities. You know, Joseph was a superhero, wasn't he? He was shipped off to a foreign land just like Daniel. He was ended up in a position of power just like Daniel. You could interpret dreams just like Daniel. They're both renamed. Eventually, through both of them, you know, Israel is kept and saved. And there's that mimicry there of saying these guys are phenomenal guys. But the key point I want to look at today is the fact, in both of the stories of Joseph and of Daniel, we see men that are people of integrity. And I looked for many definitions of integrity. And I like this one that I found by C.S. Lewis. It says, integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. That's not the only definition of integrity. There are other really good ones as well. Steve Lyons came to me afterwards and said, you know, I read one that says, integrity is the opposite of hypocrisy. And I read that one as well. I thought that's a good little one-liner. It's not, that doesn't encapsulate the wholeness of it, but it's a good one, a good definition. You know, doing the right thing in all circumstances, when you're in public display and even when you're not in public display. Let's explore that in a bit more detail. I'll just give you, if we look at Daniel chapter 6, we have a situation in Daniel chapter 6 where Daniel's one of the three leaders of the whole country. Who, you know, the king leaves everything responsible for these three leaders. And two of the leaders come to the king, and they say in verse 5, you know, O King Darius, live forever, etc., etc. And he says, we have all agreed that the king should issue an edict. They're telling lies, black and white lies. They're telling lies to get Daniel in trouble and to make them good. And the king issues this edict to say that nobody can pray to any other god apart from him, because they know that Daniel prays to our God. And we read this in verse 3. It says, Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom, not be one of three, but just be in charge himself. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him, because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charge against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God. They concluded that in business, Daniel was a man of integrity. And they thought the only way we're going to get round him is to do the dirty on him. Which is interesting, that, because I found an interesting quote about business and integrity. It says, integrity is really important in business. Once you can fake that, you've got it made. And many people in business have that attitude. If I can have the appearance of being honest, if I can have the appearance of working hard, if I can have the appearance of you know, doing the right stuff, the more interesting how it looks than actually doing it. I suppose the obvious question when it comes to this area of, you know, personal ambition and integrity is, where do you draw the line? Or to rephrase that slightly, where do you draw your lines? But we see in this chapter 1, we see Daniel drawing a line over what food he eats. That was a line that he drew. We see in chapter 3 with Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego that they drew a line, a pretty obvious line, when they were told that they had to bow down and worship the golden image in chapter 3. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. And we'll find out more about the consequences of that next week. In chapter 6, we get another line drawn. So Daniel's told that he mustn't pray to God for 30 days. And he says, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to continue to pray to my God. But then he does something strange. He could have continued to pray to his God, but he goes one step further. He makes sure the windows in his home are open so that everybody can see him praying to God. He could have carried on praying behind closed doors, but he draws a line in the sand and says, my line is here. I am not going to hide my Christianity. It's my line in the sand. I'm not going to do it behind closed doors so I don't get caught. It's my line in the sand. And the question is, in our lives, where are our lines in the sand? What will we do to fit in? Do you go along with getting drunk at office parties or to impress your mates just to fit in? Do you go along with character assassination with your friends just to fit in? Do you go along with casual racism just to fit in? What about white lies? Just to make things easy. Where are your lines in the sand? Some lines in the sand are pretty easy to go for. You know, it's black and white. Others are far more grey, and you have to make these decisions. But there are consequences to keeping a life of integrity. There are really good consequences to keeping a life of integrity. It seems to me that the main consequences is that you leave yourself in a situation where you can be used by God. People of integrity are in a situation, a spiritual situation, where God can use them, both naturally and supernaturally. You know, in the natural, you know, people of integrity are people that are trusted by others. They're people who will, for the long term, you know, get promotions. They are valued by their friends. You know, in the 2nd and 3rd century, where Christianity was not allowed, where, you know, if you're a vocal Christian, you know, you could get killed for it. We see that actually the Christians were people who were trusted in society and were given positions of authority in society. And those in authority knew they were Christians, but often, you know, turned a blind eye because they were people of integrity that could be trusted with authority. But supernaturally, we can also be used by God. Because when we stay in communion with God, we are conduits available for the power of God to work through us. And we see that all over the place in Daniel. We see Daniel as a man of integrity, but also somebody who's used by God supernaturally in amazing ways because he can hear from God. There's nothing getting in the way of him hearing from God and responding to God. You know, one of the supernatural ways was David might touch on is that King Nebuchadnezzar says to all the leaders, you know, these magicians and such like, I've had a dream, and actually, just so you're not kidding me, I want you to tell me what my dream was and then interpret it. And they'll go, hang on a minute. You tell me the dream and I'll interpret it. He goes, no. You know, you tell me the dream and interpret it. If you don't, I'm going to kill you. And they go, oh, and they turn to Daniel. Daniel, you know, can you do this dance? They say, I can't do it, but God can. And Daniel tells the king the dream and then interprets it. But on a far more down-to-earth level, you know, being a person of integrity can lead to loss, can lead to problems. We see it in Daniel. We see it in Daniel. We see the loss and the predicaments that Daniel and his friends get in. You know, we also see it in history. And I've put in the bulletin, and I won't read it, you know, but I've put in the bulletin a story of a man who lost his life because of integrity. But it also affects us just on a day-to-day basis. I was chatting to my daughter, Bethany, this week about the hassle that she has at school because she stands up as a Christian. And in RE, she stands up for Christianity and gets ridiculed. gets laughed at by the students, and doesn't get defended by the teacher. Standing up, for what you believe in, drawing that line in the sand, is tough sometimes. But there is no other option. I remember once being in a shop and being given the wrong change and saying to the woman, I'm sorry, you give me too much money here. And the woman kind of looked at me in amazement as I was giving her money back, saying, what on earth are you doing? But it gave her an opportunity to say, listen, I have no other choice, because, it's in these small things that your lines are drawn. It's in these small things that integrity is challenged. And let me tell you, speak to my wife and she'll say to me, I can blow it. I'm sure we've all, I'm not sure, maybe you haven't ever blown it, but I have blown it. And integrity is something that's sometimes, very hard to get back, and you may never be able to get back in certain circumstances. But what frustrates me more than anything when I'm chatting to non-Christians about Christianity is that the number of times that I've had to apologize for hypocrisy in Christianity. And I say this line, and I've said it dozens of times. And the line, as I say to these people, is, please don't base Christianity on Christians, base it on God. And I say that as a way of trying to apologize for the lack of integrity that they've experienced. But we have to realize that what I'm saying is wrong. We should be able to base Christianity on Christians. We should be people of integrity, that our yeses are yeses and our noes are noes, that what we say is what we get. We should be salt, we should be light, we should be ambassadors. That is the high calling. So let me really encourage you to think before you speak in these circumstances, that you are people that you hold integrity dear, that you hold your witness dear. And a final thought on this, my final thought on this area, is perhaps one of the main reasons that Daniel and his 3 friends were able to hold their integrity is because they weren't on their own. And my last question for you is, who are you accountable to? If I was to ask you just to shut your eyes just now and think of a person who holds you accountable, who helps you in your Christian life. I'm not saying think of your busy mate, because your busy mate may not do that. I'm saying the person who helps you in the areas that you struggle with, that you confess the areas that you're struggling with. Is there a person in your life that helps you to maintain integrity? And if there isn't, let me encourage you to find somebody. Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were there together and supported each other. We need to support each other. So in summary, is ambition more important than integrity? Where do you draw your lines? And who is helping you in this battle? I just pray that you'll make progress in this area. Thank you.